Good evening and welcome to Fox News. Tonight, a stunning confrontation is unfolding at the United Nations. Burkina Faso's young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, has issued a fiery 48-hour ultimatum directly aimed at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The ultimatum has shaken diplomats, rattled Western officials, and left the global community asking, what comes next? Traoré took the UN podium with an intensity rarely seen in modern diplomacy. His speech cut through the formalities and delivered an explosive warning. In just 2 days, he declared, Israel must halt its military actions in Gaza, or face consequences led not by Western powers, but by a coalition of African and global South nations ready to stand against what he called decades of unchecked aggression. The chamber fell silent as delegates realized this was no ordinary UN address. It was a direct challenge to Israel and its Western backers. The ultimatum was not just about Gaza. Traoré painted a broader picture of injustice, accusing powerful nations of manipulating global institutions while silencing voices from the global South. He demanded a reset, a balance of power where Africa and its allies would no longer serve as spectators in decisions that determine the future of the world. His words struck at the very heart of the UN system, exposing fractures that diplomats have long tried to keep hidden. Reactions poured in immediately. Israel dismissed the ultimatum as reckless and dangerous, while US officials scrambled to calm the storm, calling Traoré's remarks inflammatory. Yet behind closed doors, many admitted that his boldness had shifted the conversation. For years, African leaders have voiced frustrations quietly. Traoré just brought those frustrations to the world stage with a countdown clock attached. African delegations erupted in applause during his address, breaking the usual UN decorum. From Nigeria to South Africa, leaders praised his defiance, calling it a historic stand for dignity and independence. Social media across Africa lit up with support, branding Traoré as the voice of a new generation unwilling to bow before superpowers. In Ouagadougou, thousands poured into the streets waving national flags and chanting slogans of solidarity, treating the ultimatum as a national victory before the deadline had even begun. Western diplomats, however, saw danger in his words. A 48-hour ultimatum, they warned, could destabilize an already fragile Middle East. Analysts on major U.S. networks questioned whether Traoré had the means to enforce his warning or whether this was a bold political gamble designed to capture global attention. But in either case, the ultimatum had worked. It forced the world to confront Africa's voice in a way rarely seen at the UN. The French delegation sat stone-faced as Traoré spoke, a reminder of Burkina Faso's recent decision to expel French troops and sever military ties. For Paris, the ultimatum signaled that their former colonies were no longer content to stay in the background. Russia and China, meanwhile, watched with interest. Moscow praised Traoré's courage, framing it as part of a broader resistance against Western dominance. Beijing remained cautious, but noted that Africa's demands for equality in international affairs could no longer be ignored. The question now is what happens if Netanyahu refuses to comply within the 48-hour deadline. Traoré suggested that African nations were prepared to escalate diplomatic and economic measures, and hinted at the possibility of coordinated blockades targeting Israeli-linked trade routes across parts of Africa. While details remain unclear, the symbolism alone is powerful. A small landlocked nation, long ignored on the world stage, is daring to draw red lines against one of the world's most militarily powerful states. At the UN headquarters, tension is mounting. Journalists report a flurry of emergency meetings among Western allies, while African diplomats are rallying behind Traoré's message. The ultimatum has effectively divided the UN chamber into two camps: those who see it as a reckless provocation and those who view it as the first real act of defiance against a system dominated for decades by the West. Back in Washington, administration officials are working overtime. One senior source admitted that the U.S. is deeply concerned, not just about the ultimatum itself, but about the precedent it sets. If African leaders begin issuing direct challenges on the world stage, it could unravel years of carefully maintained influence. Traoré's speech, they fear, may embolden other nations to speak out in ways that disrupt the balance of power. As the countdown ticks, the world is watching closely. Will Israel respond with defiance, escalating tensions further? Will the West attempt to pressure Traoré into silence? Or will this moment mark the beginning of a new chapter where Africa's voice cannot be ignored? One thing is certain: the ultimatum has already changed the tone of global diplomacy. This is a developing story, and the world waits to see what will unfold when the clock runs out on Traoré's bold 48-hour demand. As the second day of Traoré's ultimatum began, the global stage grew more tense with every passing hour. The United Nations was in constant motion. Delegates rushed between private consultations. Western powers tried to defuse the situation, and African blocs stood firm in their support. The countdown clock was not just symbolic anymore. It was the central question in every diplomatic corridor. What happens when time runs out? In Israel, Netanyahu's government dismissed Traoré's words as political theater. Officials insisted that no ultimatum from Burkina Faso or any African coalition would alter their security policies. Yet behind the tough talk, intelligence briefings revealed concern. The possibility of coordinated economic or diplomatic backlash from multiple African nations posed risks that could not be easily ignored. Israeli media outlets debated whether Netanyahu had underestimated the momentum Traoré was building on the international stage. Across Africa, the mood was electric. From Dakar to Nairobi, protests and rallies demanded that their governments align with Traoré's stance. Activists painted murals of him as a new Pan-African figure who dared to speak truth to power. University students organized debates calling his ultimatum the most significant African-led diplomatic move since the non-aligned movement of the Cold War. For many, this was no longer just Burkina Faso's fight. It was a test of Africa's collective will. In Washington, alarm bells rang louder. State Department officials launched a series of calls to African capitals, warning of serious consequences if they sided too strongly with Traoré's ultimatum. But those calls seemed to have the opposite effect. Several leaders, tired of decades of pressure from the West, saw Traoré's defiance as an opportunity to push back against American dominance. Analysts described this as a turning point. The more Washington tried to control the narrative, the more Africa rallied behind its young leader. Meanwhile, Russia seized the moment. In Moscow, officials praised Traoré's courage and hinted at strengthening ties with Burkina Faso. Russian media framed him as a revolutionary voice, comparing his ultimatum to historic moments of defiance against Western imperialism. China, though more cautious, used state outlets to highlight the hypocrisy of global institutions that ignored African suffering while amplifying Western concerns. Both powers seemed eager to let Traoré's words weaken U.S. and European influence. At the UN headquarters, the hallways buzzed with speculation. Would African nations deliver on threats of economic retaliation? Could they really impose blockades or sanctions against Israel-linked trade? Or was this all about symbolism and leverage? No matter the outcome, the balance of power had shifted. Diplomats admitted openly that a precedent had been set. one that could inspire similar ultimatums in the future. By the final hours of the ultimatum, all eyes turned to Ouagadougou. Traoré addressed his people again, standing before massive crowds waving national flags. His speech was broadcast live across Africa and streamed globally. He declared that Burkina Faso would not retreat, that Africa would no longer be silenced, and that even small nations could force the world to listen. His words carried not just defiance, but hope, a vision of a multipolar world where Africa shaped its own destiny. When the deadline passed, the world held its breath. Israel did not change its military course, but the ultimatum had already left its mark. African nations began announcing joint measures, suspensions of Israeli-linked mining projects, reviews of diplomatic ties, and plans for a broader economic coalition to resist Western pressure. Though limited in scope, these moves carried symbolic weight far greater than their immediate impact. The message was unmistakable. Africa would no longer be a passive player on the world stage. Western leaders scrambled to downplay the significance, but they could not hide the reality. A single ultimatum from a 36-year-old African leader had forced the United Nations, Washington, Paris, and Tel Aviv into emergency discussions. The speech had exposed deep cracks in the global order and revealed a growing appetite for resistance against old power structures. Commentators now call this the Ouagadougou Ultimatum, a phrase that may echo for years in the halls of international diplomacy. Whether or not Traoré achieves his immediate goals, he has altered the conversation in a way that cannot be undone. His defiance has energized a continent, rattled global powers, and signaled that the era of Africa's silence is ending. As the dust settles, one thing is clear. The ultimatum may have expired, but its impact has only just begun. Traoré has written himself into the story of global politics, not as a follower of Western rules, but as a leader who dared to challenge them. And now, the world must reckon with what that means for the future of power, diplomacy, and the struggle for justice in the 21st century.